Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and today I'm going to be talking about why I love space operas more than fantasy. And obviously, there's the given disclaimer that this is my opinion, and if you like fantasies more, you're still a valid reader and all of that. But hey guys, I'm going to talk about why I prefer space operas. Please don't hate me. Does it make for a good title of a YouTube video? So for those of you who don't know, a space opera is essentially where fantasy and sci-fi meet. It's usually taking place on a spaceship in space, hence the name, but there's a lot more emphasis on personal characters and their quests and their growth, whereas regular sci-fi tends to have a lot more emphasis on philosophy and greater discussions of life and our purpose. Oftentimes, these characters will be underdogs on a dilapidated ship, and a lot of times they get thrown into it. They don't always act with a lot of purpose towards their quest. It's kind of something they're forced to do because no one else is around to do it. But I still love them, and I have found over the course of my life that I actually prefer them to standard fantasy, and I have a lovely list of reasons exactly why that is. First of all, and this is a gigantic one, is in sci-fi, there is no reliance on historical accuracy as a prop-up for all of the isms. You see a lot of times in high fantasies where they'll have sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all of that, and every single time the author always uses the same excuse. Well, I was being historically accurate. They could have dragons and magic systems and all this other totally historically inaccurate stuff, but for some reason, we also gotta have homophobia. And it makes no sense, because 90% of the time, most fantasies aren't even really all that attached to any one particular era. They'll call it medieval, but women will be wearing corsets, which weren't a thing until like the 19th century. And in sci-fi, you don't have that because there's no historical accuracy to speak of. Now, you might have characters that are saying they're being sexist for historical accuracy if they're recreating some old empire from before. A lot of sci-fi books have the Roman Empire being reborn, but even then, that's more seen as a flaw on the character's part and not something that the author themselves are supporting. Next up are the magic systems or ability systems and how I prefer them in space operas, because outright magic is still there, but it's not as pervasive. And a lot of high fantasies, 90% of the characters will have some form of magic, and a lot of these magic systems are soft magic systems, which I'm not the biggest fan of because it feels like such an easy out 90% of the time. When you don't have rules to follow and you don't really know what their limits are, it feels cheap because it's like, why does this problem exist? So they have something just magic it away. Whereas in science fiction, there's a lot more emphasis on the science of ability systems. So you'll have cyborg characters that could have a breakdown and need to get themselves repaired. You could have like magical wizard people, but they've already created technology to fight against them. Because it's based on science and logic a lot more, it tends to be a lot more harder magic or harder set ability system. And personally, I just prefer that more. I feel like it makes a lot more sense. You don't open yourselves to as many plot holes that way or illogical inconsistencies when you know right up front what a person can and cannot do. Next up is battles on spaceships always have more tension. And the biggest reason for that is space. No one can really survive in space. I've read one or two space operas where there was like one breed of people that could like hold their breath really long time and like somehow survive for short bursts in space, but more often than not, the vacuum of the cold dark abyss is dangerous to virtually everyone. Therefore, every battle on a spaceship is 20 times more tense than any battle in a ground setting, because not only could you accidentally get sucked out through an air vent or what have you, you could also end up destroying the ship itself and everybody dies. When the red lights start flashing and the alarms start blaring, it gets my heartbeat going than at any battle in any kind of ground-based fantasy dwelling. Now, in theory, you could do this with like underground battles in fantasy where like if you fight too hard, it could all crush you. But in general, most of these battles tend to be on land in breathable air. And the other thing is you could technically probably run away, or at the very least, the environment itself usually isn't as much of an issue as it is in space operas, because in space operas it is always a given issue that you want to escape the ship, you're going to have to find an escape pod. You can't just walk out the door, you're screwed. And I love that aspect. I love how like tense and dire it can get, but then again, I just love when things get really dire. This next one is a little silly, but I love it, and that is evil empires are cooler with spaceships. Yeah, so both space operas and fantasies will have evil empires. It's kind of a standard, you love to see it, but there's just something about an evil empire with like big imposing warships coming at you with cannons that is infinitely better than any kind of like people on horseback situation. Like, yeah, bunch of guys on horseback is a little bit scary. Gigantic, jagged, black battleship with cannons, scarier. Evil empires just are more evil and more, again, dire in a space opera. Next up is the non-human creatures. Now, again, this does not exist across the entire spectrum. You might have some fantasy creatures that are new to that story, and you might have some space operas that rely on generic alien creations like the Greys or the big green bug-eyed aliens. But in general, you're more likely to have a more diverse set of beings in a space opera than you are in a fantasy. Most high fantasies will copy and paste the elf, dwarf set of creatures, maybe some orcs. That's not to say, I still want my orcs as the good guys battle against elves high fantasy book. And seriously, if you know it, give it to me. I need it. But space operas tend to have just more diverse aliens in general, because there's not a lot of canon aliens to speak of beyond the Greys and little green dudes. So if they don't want to use those two, they kind of are almost forced to come up with something brand new. And I've read some fantastic aliens that were like, one was these giant like spider creatures that creeped me out, but they were the villains, so it worked. And all of that kind of thing. Now, granted, some of these can get a little bit bland, where it's like humans with an extra arm, or humans with different colored skin, and that's the extent of the differences. But when someone goes full out space opera with all of these different alien creatures, it's super fun and always original, and I just get very tired of seeing the same, you know, dwarves, elves, orcs, copy and pasted in a lot of high fantasies. If I don't ever have to see another Fae novel again for a while, that'd be great, because I went through a serious Fae binge when I was like a teenager, and I still have not recovered. Next up relates to one of my favorite tropes that is very common in space operas, and that is found families. Spaceships just lend themselves very well to found families. Like I mentioned before, you can't just easily leave a spaceship. So if we're talking about forced proximity that people love in stories, it works. You're stuck on this spaceship until they go wherever they're going. You have to talk to these people because, again, you have to keep this spaceship running or else y'all die. And as a result, space operas tend to lend themselves very well to found families and forced proximity, if you like that in your romance. And I just love that feeling of they're all working towards a purpose at some extent. Even if they all have their own personal quests, they all have to travel to the same direction. Like in a fantasy quest, you could just leave, because again, you're on land. You can just leave and go somewhere else. But in space operas, you pretty much have to stick with the group, and that creates some fantastic dynamics. This last one is probably the most debatable on my list, and feel free to debate it in the comments, but it's something that I've seen in my own personal life, and that is there's less emphasis on the great classics in sci-fi, especially space operas, as opposed to high fantasy. I know that Tolkien was fantastic, and he changed the game, and all these other things, but a lot of people are spending so much time trying to recapture that. And that's not just me speaking. George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, has gone on record as saying that people are so focused on just recapturing what the old fantasy greats did that they basically are doing the same thing over and over again. Like I mentioned before with the elves and dwarves and all of that just being copy and pasted repeatedly. Whereas sci-fi does have greats. It does have books like Dune and such, but they never reached the mainstream level of popularity that, say, Tolkien did. And as a result, there's not as much emphasis on copy and pasting and just doing what they did before. Now again, a lot of space operas tend to be a very similar setup of a group on a dilapidated ship going to do the thing, but that's more a staple of the genre as opposed to we must all copy this one thing. Now, I am by no means saying that paying homage is a bad thing or that we shouldn't learn from what the greats have come before us. But when you've effectively painted yourself into a corner and everyone is only doing this thing en masse, it gets very stale very fast. In fact, I've seen a lot of agents that I follow on Twitter talking about how they basically don't accept a lot of fantasy books anymore because it's such a bloated genre and it looks so much the same so much of the time. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you still shouldn't publish your fantasy book, and I would always suggest indie publishing, but I like space operas because there's not that reliance. People in a weird way are still trying to figure out which is the great to be followed. And thankfully, because we don't have that, there is not a lot of that same story getting told over and over again that fantasy is still struggling with. So that was my list of all the reasons that space operas are better than fantasy. Obviously, once again, you are still valid if you prefer fantasies. If you would like to argue with any one of my points, please put it down in the comments below. I'd love to get more of a discussion going. If you want to downvote because you're ride or die for fantasy, you can do that as well. I am ride or die for space opera. I get the loyalty. But with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.